Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for being with me today. I'm Ann Marshall with Art Archetype and Ancient Wisdom, and I have the pleasure today of being with Luana Rubin. I'm excited to have her here. So if I'm fumbling over my words, it's because there is so much to say about her. I don't even know where to begin. In fact, she's one of the very few people that I've ever had to read the bio because it's so extensive. So forgive me for reading, but I'm going to do just that. And that Luana is a painter, a photographer, and textile artist. She has had an incredible career working in both fashion and jewelry design. She's lived in Hong Kong and traveled to more than 50 countries for both business and lecturing on color and art. And upon returning to Boulder, Colorado, she studied art with commitment and began her fine arts career. She's been curator and juror for major exhibitions and is a Bernina ambassador. As an entrepreneur, she's founder of eQuilter, which is a 14,000 square foot warehouse with fabrics and sewing products. And Luana has made really a substantial contribution to our world, not only with the activism portrayed in her artwork, but by the fact that 2% of all proceeds from her company go to charitable contributions. In fact, Luana's company has donated a total of more than $2 million. It just really blows my mind. So what did I forget, or what else would you like to include, Luana?
Well, that was pretty good. It makes me sound like something more than how I think of myself. I mean, I really just think of myself as a business owner and an artist. And of course, I'm a mom. I have three young adult kids, and for sure an animal lover. I'm a vegetarian and a wildlife photographer in particular. Um, and I'm just so excited to be alive. I mean, that's what I want to share with people is that joy of life. And I try to express that through my work and my art.
Hmm. Well, with really your extraordinary contribution in the world of both art and activism, is there a mentor that really had a primary influence with you, or people that
Mm,
came and went into your life?
mm. I have been so fortunate to have several mentors in my life from when I was a kid in school up until getting this charity program up and running. I would say in the last 25 years of my life, the mentor who has really inspired me in that part of my life is Kathy Price, the founder of Mission of Love. She goes to Guatemala and Mexico to help the Mayan people who live in very uh, poor communities up in the mountains. She goes to Pine Ridge to help the Lakota people. And I've gone on a trip. I went on a cleft lip and palate surgery repair trip to Guatemala with her. And just, spending time with someone who spends their whole life helping others, it just kind of explodes your heart open. When you get away from your life and you're around people who have nothing, and you go with a team of other people who are there just to give and help, it radically shifts your context of your life. So I would say that, she's been a really profound influence on me over the last 25 years. And I feel so fortunate to have had a close friendship with her. She's friends with Jane Goodall. She's one of those kinds of people, but she's very humble. And so most people don't know about her or what she does.
What age were you when you did that?
Let's see, I was in my early to mid 50s, I think,
Okay.
maybe 53, something like that. And I have photos from that trip. Some of the most beautiful photos I've ever taken were when we gave a quilt to every child, every family who came to have this free surgery. There was a team of surgeons that came down to Guatemala, and it was the most beautiful light in this waiting room. And we would wrap the child in the quilt and take a picture of them with their parents, with or whoever had brought them, and made these extraordinary family photos that are just so full of light and gratitude. Just, the simple act of giving a quilt to somebody who has nothing. We also went to an orphanage and gave each of the kids a quilt of their own. And up until that time, we were told none of them had anything that belonged to them personally. And so those kind of experiences overlapping with the quilt world have really deepened my understanding, and I guess my compassion and my patience. Um, as I said, expanding your context of humanity, of how people live on this earth, is something that you always have with you once you've been exposed to it.
Mm. I can't help but insert something around the whole idea of archetypes, because I think the word you mentioned just then was compassion. And I think of advocate as being like the compassionate voice. The advocate is the one that speaks on the behalf of those that are voiceless. And
Mm,
activists, closely related, is like compassion in action. And activist does, I believe, in terms of, if we try to distinguish, which is which, activism, I think, does require a team. It doesn't work solo, whereas an advocate can work solo for the rights of others. But the advocate, I see, is like, is working on a cause. It's a movement. It's a whole change in society. Whereas advocate might be a change in law, but activism is more like a change in behavior. Do
mm,
you resonate with one of those more than the other, or do you embody them both, or how do
mm.
you see yourself in that world? Because I know it's so integral to your being.
Yeah. Well, as I said, Kathy Price really inspired me and mentored me to discover these facets of myself. She just reflected back to me what she saw in me, which is something that I try to do for others now. I think boy, it's really tough because, as you and I have discussed before, they're kind of two sides of the same thing in my world. I I think in taking on more of a leadership position in this field over the last several years, going and speaking to groups, not just quilting and art groups, but also now nonprofit groups. I recently spoke, organized through our local university for Sierra Club and Endangered Species Coalition from Washington, D.C. More and more people are interested in combining these two things, but individuals feel they don't have a voice. So I have a hard time separating those two, Anne. They're so closely related.
Mhm.
As far as if one started, I think they grew together because of my relationship with Kathy Price, because she certainly is both.
Mhm.
She she will meet with government officials in Guatemala to advocate, and by doing that, she's an activist. But she represents a group of people who feel very strongly, and often that group of people, their passion for the topic was ignited by her, you know?
Mhm.
So one person can have a huge impact on explaining an issue, explaining how it's affecting those people without a voice. And once you see it and hear it and you get it and it resonates in your heart, then you feel you have no choice but to step up and get involved.
Mhm. Is there an accomplishment that you're particularly proud of, or a cause that you're especially passionate about?
Hmm. Well, as a wildlife photographer, I've been visiting Churchill and photographing the polar bears for about 12 years. And about every other trip, I take a group with me because I want other people to become passionate about this issue as well. But what I've ended up doing over the years is documenting the decline of not only the polar bears, but all of the creatures that live in that habitat, and the shifting of the habitat, and how it's affecting the indigenous people who've lived there, way before anybody else, the Europeans came. So it's both, the stories of what happened to the indigenous people when Europeans came and started taking what they wanted from the landscape. But I would say, children and animals,
Mhm.
because they're the ones who don't have a voice. And, particularly, and again, I get this from Kathy Price, but indigenous children or children who are living in poverty and have absolutely no power and no voice. And of course, that is in the news today, right? We're hearing about children who are being killed in conflicts overseas. And if you've never been exposed to that firsthand, children living in poverty, it's just like a news item. And you have to kind of, in order to take the onslaught of the news every day, it's really hard to keep your heart open. I think our tendency is to want to close down and say, oh, I can't handle the news, I can't watch it. I watch the news because I want to know what's going on. And then the next question immediately is, what can I do to help? Because when I see one picture of a child who is suffering because of war or natural disaster, that child is not a picture on the news. That's a human being who could just as easily be my child or my neighbor's child. But the decline of the species up north has been really dramatic over the last 12 years, and that's that moved me to make a quilt. I made a polar bear quilt that had some messages stitched in that you don't see until you get close to the quilt, because it's not just climate change, but it's also the toxic pollution. When they find a carcass of a dead bear, they're finding all these toxic chemicals, and the researchers and the scientists are saying that probably the genetic damage from these toxic chemicals are going to wipe them out, or at least, decrease them dramatically faster than climate change. I don't know. That's a kind
Now,
of a
you mentioned,
long-winded answer.
Yeah, I love it. I certainly followed you. But for people who don't know, where is Churchill?
Yes, Churchill is in northern Manitoba in Canada. It's on the western shore of Lake Hudson, and it's where the Churchill River, which is freshwater, dumps into Hudson Bay, actually. Sorry, I got that wrong, which is saltwater. And there's kind of I think it's a counterclockwise churn. As a result, where the fresh meets the saltwater, that is the first place where the ice begins to form. Polar bears can only eat on ice, so they're fasting all summer long when there's no ice. They all come to this little town that's at the mouth of the river, waiting for the ice to form. And like the minute it starts to form, they're out on the ice looking for seals. That's their main diet. So anyway, it's called the polar bear capital of the world. If you go there at a certain time in the fall, you can see lots of polar bears. You used to be able to see more polar bears.
And you mentioned how you had done a quilt in that regard. Have you made other quilts then that are inspired by your compassion for children and animals?
My first large quilt that was an activist quilt, I think will answer your question. It was called Rocky Mountain Poison, and it was made for an invitational called Water is Life at the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. And it depicted an event that happened here in Colorado many years ago, the Gold King mine spill. All of this toxic bright orange water exploded out of this mine, flowed down into the Animas River that flowed through Durango, and then down through native reservations, and finally into the Colorado River. And of course, somewhere between 20 and 40 million people are affected by this water source by the time it gets to the coast in California. And so when that quilt premiered, it was in the original League of Nations building in Geneva within the UN compound. The cultural attaché, who was the official, US diplomat at the event, at the opening, he came up to me in front of my piece and he took my hand and he said, "This is a really amazing piece." He said, "You have to keep making artwork like this that tells a story." And of course, the piece shows the really severe toxins that flowed into the water and affected the communities downstream. And at first I was kind of shocked that he would go out of his way to come and talk to me and urge me to continue this work. But I got so much response from that quilt that that really put me solidly on the path of an activist artist.
Hmm. Now you have another piece that was at the Carter Library and up in New York, and tell us about that one.
Well, I have a piece at the Carter Center in Atlanta, and I also had another piece at the Clinton Presidential Library. Which one were you
I
referring
think
to?
that the Clinton Library.
Okay, so that was also an invitational, and I was invited to join this group of artists to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, but also to focus on this famous speech that Hillary Clinton gave, Secretary Clinton, when she was the First Lady in Beijing at the UN Women's Conference, where she said, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights, once and for all. So that phrase, women's rights are human rights, and that speech that she gave was the topic of my quilt. And of course, it was to an audience of people from all over the world who spoke many different languages. So I first embroidered the phrase in pink thread, and then I wrote in the phrase in 14 other languages, including Chinese and Japanese and Greek, all through the audience to show that people were absorbing that concept, women's rights are human rights, in all the different languages to all these people of all different colors from all over the world.
Where is that quilt now?
Well, it just came home to me. It was at the Clinton Presidential Library and museum for several months, and then the whole exhibit went to Houston, and it just came home to me a couple weeks ago. And where will it go next? I haven't figured that out yet.
And we have to talk about the fact that you do have is it a 14,000 square foot facility that is an online business as well as a brick and mortar to at least house the online business. How did that idea, I mean, that to me is huge. So where
Mm,
did that come from and how do you manage that?
yeah, well, that's a big story. So let's see, how far back do we want to go? In after I left the garment industry and I discovered quilting, yeah, around 1990. I went to a grocery store and I saw quilting magazines and I picked one up and went, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for. Several years went by where I visited quilt stores. And of course, my background as a fashion designer and my training is pattern making and sewing and draping and all that. Quilting came really easy for me, but I did take many classes to learn the terminology and the techniques of the quilting world. And what I discovered was none of the quilt shops had the fabric that I was looking for. In my head, I had an idea of what I wanted. I went to over 40 quilt shops during those several years, all over the country. And what I found was there were one or two fabrics that I liked, but the rest of it was all like brown ditzy calico reproduction, and I was looking for bright, contemporary, large scale, ethnic, Asian, all these different kinds of fabrics. And I finally figured out that it existed, but nobody was carrying it. So at the same time, my husband was designing websites for other companies. And I said, I have this idea to start a little part-time business in the basement of our house so I can stay home with the kids. And actually, we opened in March of 99, and within 60 days, we had exceeded our 3-year business plan
Oh
because
my,
it turned out that I had identified a niche, a very hungry niche that was not being served. And of course, being able to reach out to people around the country and eventually around the world, really focusing on those contemporary, bright, colorful, and ethnic fabrics, we tapped into something that was not being served at the time. So we started in March of 99. We moved into our first warehouse in October. A year and a half later, we had to move out of that warehouse. A year and a half later, we had to expand the next warehouse. And then finally, we built this building. We're in a 23,000 square foot building, and we have 2 tenants. So we occupy 14,000 square feet, including my studio.
Mm.
And my husband is my partner. When our sales exceeded the sales of the company he was managing, he said, "I think I better come work for you." So actually, we're equal partners, and he's become a quilter. He's in charge of our free quilt program, and he purchases the art for our exclusive Rubin design line, which is exclusive digital printed fabrics.
Mm.
Those really unusual, artsy, dramatic kind of designs that we cannot get from our vendors, because some of the stuff we do is pretty out there. And we're encouraging the market to create more of that super creative, highly artistic, creative type of artwork. But, a lot of the quilt shops, they don't want that kind of artwork. They want to carry things that are familiar and safe. So we carry things that are different.
Mhm.
You just have to go and look to understand. It's pretty obvious once you go to my website, the type of things that we carry.
So this might be tongue in cheek, but I mean, is your fabric stash like on the other side of your studio, and it's the whole store, or do you have selective fabrics that are within arm's reach of your studio?
Yeah. Um, I always tell my customers, you guys have first pick, but when you're done, I go through the scrap bin and I pull things out for my stash. And I particularly love batiks and hand dyes. So, if you include both my stash and my studio and the whole business, that thing they say, the one who dies with the most fabric wins. I'm right up there for sure. I'm always throwing fish back into the pond. I mean, there may be things that I pulled out into my fabric library as a textile designer maybe 10 or 20 years ago, and then now it doesn't have that much meaning to me. So I'll put it back into one of our scrap packs. We have leftover scrap packs, so whenever we get to the end of a bolt, which is a lot, I mean, we have tons of that stuff, we make them up into scrap packs, and we have a very dedicated group of customers who watch for when those come online and they grab them.
Oh, I can imagine. And how did you come up with the charitable contribution amount and an idea, and who that gets distributed to?
hmm Well, that was inspired by the loss of a child. We lost our daughter, baby Hannah, at full term from a cord accident during labor. That's another whole story, but that was in the first year of our marriage, and it was a very, very difficult time for us. And as came out of, I was in a really deep depression for about a year. As I came out of that, well, actually, on the very first day after it happened, I said to my husband, some good has to come of this. And I started to think about, at that time, they said they were reporting that 30,000 children died every day from really simple preventable causes. And I kind of latched onto that and I said, I would like to do something to help those 30,000 mothers and families and siblings who are losing a child every day around the world. It was just mind-boggling to me. And that's how I met Kathy Price. And so by the time the business came together, and around 9/11, I think, is when things really started to expand, we had started the program, but then we started thinking about natural disasters and orphans and environmental issues and so on. So every single recipient, I guess we would say, is very carefully chosen. We wanted to choose a group so that every customer, when they checked out, would find something that would resonate with them. The breast cancer research, of course, has been very popular, but it's also very personal because my mother was a breast cancer survivor and my husband's mother was a breast cancer survivor. And of course, because we're in an industry of women, we all know plenty of people who've had to fight this disease, and not everybody survives. More people are surviving now, of course. My mother had it when she was 46, and she survived for another 40 years, which was amazing. I
Hmm.
recently lost her, but she was a person who was always working to help other people, and she was really an inspiration in my life as well.
So for people watching, we want to make sure that included in links will be the eQuilter.com, the business that you referred to. We'll also include the page that goes to the direct charities that you give to. You've done a wonderful lecture on art and activism. I think that would be really terrific for people to see as well, and other resources as well, because you do offer so much, and I would love for people to really kind of drill down
Mm,
and get lost in all that you provide.
mhm.
Now, I'm curious, so with as much work as you do, lecturing and travel and photography and the business, how do you structure time and discipline in the studio? Does that come in spurts, or is it routine days of the week or designated times? How do you make that all work?
Well, looming deadlines are a great inspiration. And I would say for the last several years, that has been a main motivator. When I'm invited to participate in a prestigious project or something that's really near and dear to my heart, and I make a commitment to that, then I'm going to get that piece done. It has been difficult. I've been a caretaker for my mother for many years, and sadly, we lost her just a couple weeks ago. But that actually is going to open up a big part of my schedule and energy, frankly, to get back into the studio. And I just turned 65 2 days ago. And so now I'm just thinking, if not now, it's never going to happen. So I'm actually making a commitment to spend more time in the studio. And I'm going to have to answer that question for myself, Anne,
Hmm.
whether I'm going to structure time because, I'm still running a business. And I have one adult child at home who's recovering from Lyme disease, so I still, have some things that I'm needing to take care of, and a new puppy.
Oh my goodness.
Uh, but I see my schedule opening up now, and of course, how much I travel really impacts how much I'm in the studio. So right now I only have one trip for this year coming up. I'm going to QuiltCon. Last year I traveled quite a bit. I was kind of making up for, not traveling during the pandemic. In fact, I hit platinum status on United for the first time in my life this year, which is a big deal. I've been a gold flyer for many years, but platinum, like, wow, how did that happen? Um, but wherever I travel, I always meet quilters. We've got this huge worldwide quilting tribe, and I just put in my eQuilter newsletter, which goes out to 120,000 subscribers, and on Facebook, hey, I'm going to, like last summer, I'm going to Helsinki. Is anybody there want to meet up? And so I ended up meeting one person who introduced me to the Helsinki Quilt Guild. And on my way back from my trip, at the end of the trip, I gave a lecture to the guild. So that's kind of the way it goes. Like when I go up on a polar bear trip, I've given lectures. In the last few hours before I go to the airport, I've gone to speak to the Winnipeg Quilt Guild. So I love speaking to groups. I do speak to groups online via Zoom all over the world. Several months ago, I did a lecture online to I think it was the Vancouver or Victoria Island in British Columbia. I gave a talk to them. And I just love sharing images of quilts or on the topic of art and activism. I'm very passionate about sharing what I know and what I believe.
Mm. Now, I I know as well you are what's called a color forecaster, at least you have done that. Can you
Mhm.
speak to that? Because that's something I bet a lot of people aren't even aware of and don't have much information about.
Mhm. Well, I became interested in color and trend forecasting when I was in the garment industry. It turned out to be one of the areas of inquiry that was really fascinating to me. And eventually I joined the Color Marketing Group, which is an international color trend forecasting group. And they have members from Pantone, the people who choose the color of the year, but also people in the car industry and the cosmetics industry and the paint industry. And it was really interesting to get to know how these people who are making multi-million-dollar color decisions for their products, how they arrive at their conclusions. And I found that I have a similar track. I tend to think about color in a different way from somebody who's choosing paint or floor tiling or, furniture or things like that. So I was a member of the group for 16 years, and during the pandemic, I stepped back from the group, but I'm still extremely active in color forecasting for our business.
Hmm. Can you share any secret?
Um, I'm not quite ready to do that, but I will just talk about how we arrive at a color forecast. So in years where let's say that we've had a run of where cool greens have been very popular, then we can just automatically assume that warm greens are going to be coming back. So we have that's exactly what's happening. We've had cool greens like pine green and mint green and kind of that retro 50s green. You know what I mean? And sea glass green, those cool greens have been very strong, and that with that mid-century modern design trend that's been happening for many years. And so I find myself just automatically going towards warm greens. So avocado green, olive green, moss green. And in fact, I just ordered a olive green velvet couch for my living room. I said, it's time for a big change. And originally I was going to get a blue velvet or a teal velvet, and I've had purple before. But all of a sudden, a warm green just sounded right to me. And a warm green like an olive or moss green is very cozy, very homey. It feels like you'd want to sit in front of a fire or read a book or have a cat on your lap, sipping tea. It just feels like the ultimate comfort color to me right now. So yeah, and of course the pandemic has really shaken things up. We're still trying to figure out who we are and where we're going. And I think with the events in the world today, we're still kind of in that place of limbo. So people spent a lot of time at home, and then they wanted to spend time traveling to kind of shake that off. And I think the economy has been soft. So people are kind of balancing their need to get out and travel or maybe, go shopping and spend money with wanting to stay home, which is, of course, for an online business is good for us because people are home in their jammies on their olive green couch, maybe. Um, I would predict that all more people will be getting olive green couches in the next year.
Hmm. Interesting. And now, outside of maybe more studio time, what is next for you? What's
Hmm.
on the horizon?
Well, honestly, I think just pursuing my career as an artist. When I was younger and I realized that I didn't want to be like my mom, I didn't want to have to depend on a man to have an income and financial security. So even though I identified as an artist, I knew that I needed to make money. And so I was kind of pointed by a couple of mentors towards illustration and then towards fashion design. That was, some people may think that's not a money-making career, but for me, compared to being a painter and an artist, that was a way to make money, right? It's all it's all relative. But at that time in my life, I had a plan that when I was 50, I was going to return to being a full-time painter or artist. Well, it didn't happen because I have the blessing and curse of a successful business, and I'm really proud of getting my business and all of my employees through the pandemic and keeping everybody employed. And I took that really seriously. But especially now, when you hit that age of 65, it's kind of like this is some me time. So I've been discussing with my husband getting back to hopefully more of a full-time art career. So that's what I'm going to be working on for the next couple years, is figuring out how to do that, because that's where my heart and soul is. And I think we all feel like we need to go through some healing after what we've been through the last several years. And that's really healing for me, to just get in the studio and make art. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of what I'm thinking of now.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you have a piece in mind on the next one that you'll start, or one that you're currently working on that needs to be finished?
Well, everything that was in the studio finished and went out to shows, and I've been shipping things to museums and galleries. And so I have two new pieces that I'm working on. One is about an archetype of kind of a mama bear spiritual warrior, which is an expression of me for sure. And I also am thinking about making a piece about the children of war. And one of the last pieces I did was painted faces of, and then as I built out the piece, it became women, generations of women going back through history, sort of archetypal matriarch ancestors holding the globe. And I'd like to do another piece with faces, with painted faces, but it will be the children of war. And it will definitely be about, every night I pray for peace. Every night I pray for peace. And I just wish the whole world would join me. And so I'm going to make a piece that will be basically a prayer for peace.
Hmm. It brings me to tears just to think about it.
Mm,
And that might be a really good place for us to kind of land on our final content and subject, and that is, when you go inside your heart, what do you want the world to know?
mm. That's a big question, Anne.
Mhm. Yes.
Um, I would really love to see this younger generation of women being empowered to step up into leadership roles. No mother would ever send their child to war. And I would really love to see more women and mothers and grandmothers in government making leadership decisions, because I believe that that would shift um, the dynamic of the world more towards compassion. And so I'm encouraging young women to feel empowered about having a voice and making a difference.
It couldn't have been more beautifully stated. And again, we kind of started with that energy that you bring, that you exude, advocate and activist, and end with it as well, as just such a powerful presence about you. And I feel so honored that you shared that with us. And I hope that whoever gets to the privilege of seeing this really will take the opportunity to look at the resources that will be attached. And Luana, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And
Oh, thank you, Anne.
your contribution to this world is really amazing and inspiring. And I think I know that I, for one, have been altered from it. So other people are too. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Anne. It was a pleasure.
Blessings.